So welcome. It's good to see you all and to be here together for a short little while to study some Torah and talk about this week's Parashat Shavua. This week we are reading Parashat Pikudei, which, because it's a leap year, comes on its own. The last two portions of the book of Shemot, Exodus, usually come together, Vayakel, Pikudei. They're each shorter, but we often read them together. But in a leap year, where we on the Jewish calendar means we have a whole extra month. That means we need 4 more weeks of Torah portions. So Vayakel and Pikudei get split into 2 weeks, and Pikudei stands on its own. For those of you who like Pikudei or its Haftorah, you get to sometimes see that, but because of its connection actually to the time of year falls between Pesach, around Purim and before Pesach, there are also some special parshiot. We don't always get to see all the Haftorah at this time of year. But anyways, sort of a side note there. If you've been following along with Parashat Shavua, and if you've been in these classes or reading on your own, you'll know that the last couple of weeks we've been really focused on reading about the architectural designs of the tabernacle, the sacred space, the transportable sanctuary that the children of Israel built. The Torah describes first the details of what it's supposed to look like, and then describes the details as it was being built. And if you're following really closely, you'll notice that some of those details are in fact almost word for word the same. Right, I know that also because just a few weeks ago it was my daughter's bat mitzvah, and she learned the Torah reading for Truma. And last week in Shul, as they were talking about building the part of the tabernacle that she read about the design of, she knew the Torah reading for 2 parshiot later, even though she hadn't prepared it, because really word for word it's the same. People who are architects love these parshiot sometimes, and it really focuses on constructing this sacred space in the desert, and a sacred space that will be transportable, and one that becomes central to the Jewish people, both in the story that the Torah tells, and then as we go past the Torah and they settle into the land. The tabernacle stays with them for many generations until, by the biblical narrative, until Solomon builds the temple and we create a permanent space, sacred space. But that comes many books later. What I'd love for us to do today, though, is focus on the very end of the book of Shemot. It's one of those moments that we focus on, right, liturgically in synagogue when we finish a book of the Torah. Right after finishing, the Torah reader, there's a ritual. The Torah reader calls out Chazak, Chazak, V'ni Chazek, and we repeat it. So it's repeated twice, saying, let's get strength from the fact that we finished a book and be strengthened moving forward into the next book. All right, Judaism, like we're always reading our books, right? When we celebrate the end of the book of Exodus, we already ask for strength to take us into the book of Leviticus. Or even it's half a year from now when we finish the Torah, the day we finish the Torah, we start reading it again. So we're always marking these moments of the ends and the beginnings of books. We're going to take a little bit of a look at that today. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to pull up from the last verses of this week's Parsha, which are also the last verses of the books of Exodus, so we could see how things end. All right, I'm sharing my screen and starting my slideshow. So it's, sorry. I shared my screen and then tried to share the doc, hit the wrong button. Pardon me, you would think 2 years into the pandemic, I would hit the right button on Zoom. There we go. So the book of Exodus ends with these words. When Moses had finished the work, that is the work of building the tabernacle, the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the presence of God filled the tabernacle. When the cloud lifted from the tabernacle, the Israelites would set out, but if the cloud did not lift, they would not set out until such a time as it did lift. For over the tabernacle, a cloud of God rested by day, and fire would appear in it, meaning in the cloud by night. in the view of all the house of Israel throughout their journeys. So this is the end of the book. The work of the tabernacle, which we've been reading about for weeks, has finished. The closing moments is the cloud, is the presence of God descending into the tabernacle and appearing as a cloud that sometimes at night lit up with fire. I guess it provided some central lighting to the Israelite encampment. And not only did it represent God's presence in the midst of the camp, it served as a guide for when they should travel. The cloud would float, says these verses, above the tabernacle when they were supposed to pack up and start moving. And when it was time to rest and stay in one place, the cloud would settle into the tabernacle. The Israelites would encamp and they would stay there. When I think about this as the end of a book of the Torah, I think about in my head, I think about like the movie or the television series. And actually, I think this should be a movie, because right now in our, in the mode of making television series today, right, the end of a season has the big cliffhanger for the next season. There's no cliffhanger at the end of this book of the Torah. There is this great moment that I think is the great of the end, right? A great end to a movie, and maybe one that they're not thinking about the sequel, right? I picture a big expanse in the desert with the tabernacle in the middle and the Israelites camped all around. And then you see, in whatever Steven Spielberg effects you can imagine, somehow the presence of God dropping from the heavens into the tent. And as the sun sets behind, the cinematic panorama, the cloud that has entered the tabernacle lights up with fire and provides light in the center of the screen and the center of the encampment for the Israelites. And it seems like a nice and peaceful close to the end of this book. Some of what I was thinking as I thought about the end of the book and this theme is, well, what is the book of Shemot about? And it made me go back to the beginning of the book of Shemot, which I'm going to pull up next, because the book of Shemot that we're ending gets its name from the first verse of the book, right? In Hebrew, Ve'ela Shemot b'nei Yisrael haba'im Mitzrayma et Yaakov ishu veito. Right, these are the names, the Shemot, right? Those names of the children of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each coming with their household, and then we get a whole list of names. The beginning of the book of Shemot starts with a connection back, right? It gives you the setting. The setting of the book of Shemot is we're here in Egypt, where right our biblical ancestors came at the end of the book of Breshit, and it starts by listing who are the characters from before that came. And none of these characters are characters in the book of Shemot, but in Hebrew, we take the names of our books often from the first verse, and so Shemot is the second word, right? Elah is sort of these. We don't name so many of our books, right? These or the, or right, we like to use the first good noun. So Shemot is there, and so in Hebrew, the book we just finished is the book of names, but it actually starts as the book of names, and while, right, because it comes from the first verse, might be a reason to call it the book of names, but I actually wonder, is that like a good name for this book based on your experience of it? So hang on a minute, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and come back to you, and I'm going to put this question to all of you and ask you to think about it and add to the chat. We'll see what the collective wisdom is. If you were to give a name for the book of Shemot that fits what you think this book was about, right? You have total editorial freedom. You've been studying Shemot with us for the past couple of months, and you've thought about what's there. What do you think is the best name for this book? Put it in the chat. Let's see what people come up with. All right, Gail says building community. Ooh, The Great Escape. I love that movie. That's nice too. House. Tanya says, hello, my name is God. Journeys. Community building. Journey or freedom. Welcome to Israel. The Great Deliverance. Ooh, instructions. Nice. Birth of a nation. Oh, Tanya, you got a couple good ones today. Freedom now, says Stephen. Identity. Nice. Roni, I appreciate that. New beginnings. Nice. Instructions again. So we're seeing a couple different themes emerge. Yichus, says Nels Katzman. Oh, yichus, right? Is that what you meant? I think that's the Yiddish there. Yichus, like connections, yeah. Names tell us about individual choice and that each of us make a choice when we hear the commandments. Oh, nice. That's a connection to the actual name, right? We have names. Names point to the individual, and right. It's a tension in Judaism, right? Individual choice versus communal choice, right? Communal commitment. We're a people, but then we all find our own path within that people. Something to think about. All right, we see lots of different names, and I like how they each echo different things of the book. If you were to, so building on that question, but there are a lot of different things in the book of Shemot, and the names that you put in the chat point towards different key plot themes or different key moments. So let's think about that as well as we're finishing the book of Shemot. What are the top 3 moments of the book of Shemot, you think? Let's see add that to the chat too. If you had to name, in your view, what are the top 3 moments? All right, they're starting to come in. The rise of Moses, giving of the Torah. Sinai, golden calf, building Mishkan. That's from the middle of the book. Revelations. Right? Ooh, meeting God. I like that one, Joel. There are a number of those. Tabernacle, golden calf, Sinai. That's a theme that's emerging. The dwelling of God's house, or maybe in God's house. What stuck with you is when Moses learned Aaron would be priest. Ooh, Linda, I like that. A very specific moment, right? There's a lot of potential drama there, right? Moses has a leadership role and Aaron takes on a different one. There's a separation between Moses' leadership and Aaron's leadership. I love that moment. Ooh, 10 plagues. Get ready, we're about to note right? A lot of these moments you get to touch on maybe at your Seder and Passover coming up soon. Right, receiving commandments, making an idol, building the tabernacle. Following faith and forgiveness. I like that, Karen, and the alliteration as well. There's a good essay in that. The book of Shemot, following faith and forgiveness. Tanya says, Prince of Egypt, let my people go. You build it and I will come. Nice. Right there, those early days in the Prince of Egypt. The early part of the Moses story. All right, we're seeing a whole wide range of themes, which is terrific. There's no right answer to either of these questions. I think for me, it's always interesting, especially because we have such a broad and diverse group here, to see all the different takes that people in our weekly Torah study group have here about what this book was about. I'm going to go back to sharing my screen and make a few suggestions of my own. I'm going back to the share. Here we go. So before we opened up to these questions, right, we talked about how the book of Shemot starts with this reference back to what happened in Genesis. Right? When I think about the book of Shemot, I realize these are the first verses listing the names of the people who came down to Egypt. When I think of what the first verse is, I really think it's the 8th verse of Shemot that sets the stage for what this book is going to be. Right, the first 7 verses are sort of a preamble. Right, if I were editing it as a novel, those would be right. The first 7 verses would be like on the preamble page before chapter 1. And chapter 1 for me really starts with Vayakom Melech Hadash al Mitzrayim Asher Lo Yadat Yosef. Right, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. it does connect back to what happened at the end of Genesis, but really says we've moved ahead since the last book, and we're starting a new story. And the new story is set in this context where what happened in the past has faded from memory, and our people in Egypt are no longer facing the scenario in which they moved there, but the world has overturned itself, and there's a new they find themselves in a new setting with new challenges. And I think in some ways for me that frames a lot of what I think the book of Shemot has been about. There's a lot of new starts, new challenges, right? Resetting, where new things happen that it changes the way things work. Right, a new king rises over Egypt, and that starts a new path for the people of Israel who, instead of being free, are enslaved. We find Moses, who by the details of his own early history, ends up being raised in the house of Paro, but starts a new life as a shepherd in the wilderness, and one who, instead of being part of the royal family in Egypt, will be the one who topples the rule of the royal family in Egypt. Right, we see another new thing for the people as they start in Egypt in slavery and they move to the desert, which they leave to be free of serving Pharaoh, but instead and free to serve God. And we see the people's struggle with the transition from some generations of slavery to emerging free, but then the tensions they feel, as they become the people of God. Right. We see that transformative moment also at Sinai. Many of you mentioned that, where we move from people freed from bondage by God, but now start to learn about what this relationship is going to look like and what the society or the vision of the society that we're going to build is going to look like. And then think about what are the things we need to make that possible. And some of that goes into the building of the tabernacle, which happens at the end. So in some ways, I think of this book as all these changes that really change what reality looks like, something new that happens that changes what things look like, and then you watch people adapt. That's how I think about this and some of the answers to the book, to the question I posed about what's in the book. And that's my 2 cents for the questions I posed to you. I want to share one more, and then I want to open it up for your thoughts and questions to this. The last slide I have, it's a little, sorry for the smaller font. I wanted to keep it on one page here. This is from the commentary of the Ramban, Nachmanidis. We call him in English a medieval Torah commentator who lived in Spain, wrote an extensive commentary on the Torah. At some points really lengthy, well, Rashi might be first and foremost among commentators. Ramban is definitely in the near second or third, depending on your list, in terms of a go-to person to see what's there. Here's how he ends his commentary on the book of Shemot, and in doing so, it shows a little bit about what he thinks the theme of the book was, because he says, "Thus the book of redemption is completed, in which the Eternal, the God of Israel, entered for the children of Israel, the people who are close to God. God saved them from the hands of those who hated them and redeemed them from the hands of their enemy." So it's interesting to me that he ends his commentary with the name he puts on Sefer Shemot, the book of names, or when we call it Exodus in English, right? The book about leaving Egypt. He calls this the book of redemption. Sefer Geulah, he says in Hebrew. And why is it the book of redemption? Well, it's the time where God enters into the narrative, into the book, into the lives of the people of Israel. Right before this book, God's relationship had been with individuals, right? Individual patriarchs and matriarchs. God enters into the lives of the people as a whole in this book. And the Ramban focuses on God saves them from the hands of those who hated them and redeemed them from the hands of their enemy, focusing on, right, not just freedom from bondage, but, right, an oppression of an outside enemy. Some of that is, I think, about the read of the book of Shemot, and some of that also is about life in the Middle Ages, especially for Ramban, who lived Well, he lived in Spain. It was an area that sometimes was part of the Muslim Empire and sometimes part of the Christian Empire, and he sort of faced external pressure from those who were often not so great to the Jewish people. So it might be some of the way he describes this God saving from hands of the enemy and redeeming them from the people who hate them. Might have to do also with how he reads the current story of the Jews in his time with an external enemy and an external empire, right, like that of Pharaoh. Then he ends of Pharaoh in Egypt. Then he ends after this short summary with a blessing that I think also is telling about what he thinks about the book. Blessed be God who delights in the peace of those who serve God and who help them come this far, renewing their youth as they grow old. God satisfies their hunger with Torah, nourishes them from its fat and honey, preparing their hearts to seek God and to bless God's name morning and evening. Blessed be God whose bounty we have partaken and through whose goodness we live. What I like about this this bracha, he ends his commentary of the book of Shemot with, and I hope it came through in the English that I brought, because I think it's a little clunky, or the Hebrew's really poetic with many biblical references that don't come across in translation the same way. Some relates to the theme of the book, right? He's blessing God, delighting in the peace of those who serve God, right? In theory, Bnei Israel moved from not a peaceful time to a peaceful moment, right? And that's what I see in that last scene as God's presence comes to rest in the Mishkan. Right? We've been through redemption. We're out of slavery. There were some rough points in the desert with the golden calf. We've survived that incident. We built a holy space for God, and God's presence now rests peacefully in the tabernacle and helps the people, serves as a light and a beacon of when and where they're supposed to travel. It's a peaceful moment, noting that they've come far and that they will need youthful energy. They'll need energy on the road ahead. And some of the blessing for God is not just for bringing peace to those who serve God, the Israelites, and strength as they move forward, but maybe also to us. And it notes also that God satisfies their hunger with Torah, right? We noted that in the book of Shemot, in the book of Exodus, the people get Torah from God. There's revelation at Mount Sinai where the commandments are given to them. That's not just something that's satisfying for the Israelites, but for Ramban, as he notes here, that's something that continues into the generation. And it's not just the Israelites who nourish themselves from the fat and honey of Torah. Fat, chalev in the Hebrew is it's a delicacy in our diet today. We want to reduce fat content. Maybe this is right, the good fats from coconut and avocado. So it's right. We don't think of fat and honey in the same category necessarily now. For the Rambam, they did. But the Torah nourishes them and prepares their hearts to seek God and to bless God's name morning and evening, which is a way of saying all the time, or maybe a reference to the fact that we do that in Tefillah. And Ramban's final words on the book are to say, bless God, of whose bounty we have partaken, in whose goodness we live. A dual meaning about the Torah, right? We partake in Torah because we live on the path, right? We live Torah. But we also see its bounty in that we study it, and especially at the end of the book, where we're concluding the study of that book and our conversations about it. We feel both how the stories, the tales, the values, the laws in the book provide goodness to our lives and can feel like a bounty, not just when we live them, but also when we study them. And for Ramban especially, who's a scholar of Torah, and one who writes commentaries, right? I feel his world's even stronger because, not only was his profession giving us access to this bounty of Torah and helping us to find meaning in how we live it, that's what we gain that both from Torah, but we also gain that from him, and it's a way in which we see God's bounty gets passed on from generation to generation. All right, I'm going to stop my share and come back. There we go. All right. As Ooh, I see that as I was not sharing my, as I was sharing my screen, as didn't see the chat as much. I see we've had some comments coming in. So we have a few minutes left, and I would love to just hear responses to this musing on the book of Exodus and this moment at the end, where we've reached this central time in the Torah. God's presence is here in the tabernacle. We have some laws coming ahead and some more journeys of the people of Israel is moving forward. But in the interim, at this pause point, as we shift from one book to the next, with either some of the things you've seen in the chat or that we've shared, that I've shared with you today, I wonder what's your takeaway from the book of Shemot, and what's your takeaway from the learning today? So, Tom, I see you're raising your hand. I'm hitting my Ask to Unmute button. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm curious, why was Moses not allowed to come into the tabernacle when the cloud was over it?
Awesome. That's so in the verses that I gave, right, if you looked at the whole verses, I put that detail aside. It's a really interesting one. We know Moses goes to the tabernacle. It's a place where Moses communicates with God. We'll see this a lot in the book of Leviticus, Vayikra, that's coming next. God speaks to Moses in Ohel Moed, right, in the tent, and the tent is part of the tabernacle. But we learn this detail that as the presence of God fills the tent, Moses can't go in anymore. And the commentators spend a lot of time on that. I think that's a great question. What many of the commentators say, right, there's a sense that, right, when the presence of God fills a space as intensely as it did in the tabernacle, it makes it so that humans can't be in that space. That maybe, we could be close to God, but not that close. And it shows that in some way God's presence in the tabernacle is, can be overwhelming, and that there needs to be a certain distance between the human divine contact, especially in the case of, right, if by the narrative of the Torah and, right, our stories about Moses, right, no one ever got as close to God as Moses did. But even for Moses, there has to be some distance, and that seems to be what the verses are hinting at. But I would say it's one of those great pieces, Ginger, of Torah that's up for commentary. We don't know for sure. The Torah doesn't tell us. It just tells us that Moses has to keep some distance. The question is, what meaning can we draw from that? Does that make sense or not? We'll have to struggle with. But great question. I love that you noticed that detail. Tanya, go ahead.
Okay, Rabbi, I think a pivotal point in the book of Shemot is when Moses is at the bush and when he asks God, whom shall I say? Whom shall I tell them that sent me? And God tells his name. And I think that's the connection. That's the key point right there. God not only has to introduce himself to Moses, he has to introduce himself to the nation as a whole, because the patriarchs knew him. He revealed himself to them individually, and now he had to show them to the whole nation in a big way. And the plagues in Egypt, I think, were not so much for the Egyptians, but for the Israelites to learn who he was and what he can do. And one real quick question, Rabbi. I remember when they built the tabernacle and it filled up with smoke. Could you comment on that compared to what happened with the building of the Mishkan when God's presence came?
Sure. First, I like your comment, especially because of the connection between Shemot, the name of the book in Hebrew, right? It's about names, and a key element is God's name and God introducing God's self to the people, right? And introductions happen by name. So I like how you carried through that theme. I think the tabernacle, there are different words that the Torah uses for, right, God's presence, right? It talks about a cloud of God coming into the tabernacle. Sometimes the text talks about, right, the smoke comes in from right inside the cloud, fire comes at night to light up, and I guess the fire had smoke. I think there are different descriptions that, depending on what mode the tabernacle's in, right, is the cloud of God there, is the fire there, which also includes smoke. Different substances are described as being in or rising from the tabernacle at different times. It's hard for me to know for sure what the Torah means, right? The descriptions of the divine presence in the midst of the Israelites are, in my view, theologically, right, at best, metaphors for what the Torah is trying to describe, because I think it's hard to know what God's presence feels like that intensely. But sometimes both at Sinai and in the tabernacle, we see God in fire and God in smoke and God in loud noises, and sometimes God in clouds. And those images, we see both at Mount Sinai and in the tabernacle in different ways. I think it's good, Tanya, that you noted that, it's described different ways at different times. And it's worth digging in there about what do each of those images mean. And what do they mean to you? And what might the text be saying that God appears in different ways at different times? All right, I see in the chat that Dr. G is waiting with the question. I don't see, but I don't see, you haven't virtually raised your hand and you're not on my screen right now.
Oh, okay, I did, and I don't go with the video, but my comment has to do with Ginger's question about Moses and the tabernacle. And my feeling with that is, if we go back to the fact that from Maimonides and the 13 principles, that God has no body, and we also talk about the fact that that Moses did not actually see God, but only saw the glory of God. That if we talk about the fact of having the pillar during the day or the fire at night, that is more of God than man is allowed to see. That's my feeling about that.
Oh, gotcha. Right. I think that's a great comment that adds light to it, right? There's a tension between, in Judaism and lots of religions, between, right, I guess about the question, how much of God can you see, right? And Maimonides is definitely one who stands in the camp that says, God does not have a body, right? God is different from humans. The Bible uses a lot of anthropomorphic language about God. God's hand, outstretched arms, right? That is a phrase that comes up a lot. And the question, right? For Ramban, those are very much metaphorical. And we see in Shemot, and especially today, about God's presence resting in the tabernacle. Maybe we see metaphorical language about cloud or smoke or fire. Or maybe we see it's more literal language that, while we can't see God's self, we can see certain manifestations that take on certain forms, right, in terms of clouds or smoke that are not corporeal. They're not a body, but maybe that's a form we can see. But it's a great question that people speculate on. All right, Joel, I see your hand up. You can go next, and then Susan, you'll be after Joel. Oh, Joel, I can see that you're trying to talk, but can't hear you right now. See if you can unmute. I think I just hit the...
Okay. Here's my, the book of Exodus, Shemot, lays the foundation for the Passover Seder. This is the #1 event in our homes that Jews throughout the world celebrate. So in this Passover Seder, the question that I'd like to pose to you, what are the 2 or 3 great moments in this Seder, this Passover Seder in your house, would you say? What are these moments that you talk to your family about?
That's a great question, right? And that's a great question. I also love that, Passover comes, like we spend a lot of time on the themes of Passover in the book of Shemot. And then we usually have, a month or so between when we finish reading the book and then we gather together in our homes to talk about the same story, right, at a Passover Seder. For me personally, if you're asking, I would say I love the piece of the Seder that says, in each generation, we have to envision ourselves as if we left Egypt. It gives us a time to talk about how do we read ourselves into the biblical narrative, and how is it that, that metaphorically in our own times, we're trying to free ourselves, to liberate ourselves from things that distract us from the path we're supposed to be on. That's one theme that's important. For me, I also like to think about some of the differences between the story in the Bible and the story in the Tabernacle, in the Haggadah and Pesach. If you notice, look carefully on Passover, there's a really important character in the book of Exodus who doesn't get mentioned at all in the Haggadah. I see some people nodding, but I'll give it away, right? Spoiler alert, if you don't want to know, right, close your ears for a second, but Moses does not appear in the Haggadah at all. We don't mention Moses at the Seder. To me, that's a really interesting fact. Like, I can't imagine the telling of this story without Moses, but then again, there it is in the holiday ritual. Moses is not a character. And I love that question about how could the main character of the book of Exodus not be a main character on the night of Passover? What do you think? And to me, that leads to great conversations. Joel, thanks for that question. Susan, go ahead. Oh, let me hit the magic button so you can unmute.
Thank you. Mazel tov on your daughter's bar mitzvah. And what I wanted to say, my question is related to the two parshas repeating themselves. And I need help with more metaphors, because the God I believe in is really not that interested in all of these details. And the God I believe in has so many times in the Tanakh repeated so many statements, and not all of them, but many of them I can figure out why they're repeated. They're so important. But this, I need more ideas, more metaphors. I just haven't felt one that feels comfortable regarding the repetition between Teruma and Pikudei. Thank you.
Oh, Susan, that's a great question. I would say you're not alone. And I first, just on a practical level, as someone who, as a regular synagogue goer on Shabbat, who's, following Parshat Shavua, and someone who's, these last 4 weeks are more challenging. There are ways in which I think the Torah is front-loaded, right? There are years where I wish, can't we spend twice as long in Genesis and do some of Exodus and Leviticus faster, right? Because, in the Parshat Bereshit, the first Parsha, there are like 12 unbelievably fantastic, really dense and shorter stories, and if you do something like, and when we were at Parshat Bereshit, someone came to you here for the Parsha class and probably got to focus on one of them, and there were 11 you didn't get to touch on. So good, it's a good thing there's next year. But then we had 4 weeks to talk about, the knobs on the poles on the tabernacle that they put the ropes around to hang the tent, and what materials they were made of. And so I just want to acknowledge, right, that is a dilemma. I'll put a challenge to you that I don't have an answer for, but that a professor of mine once said, because, he caught someone, and we were in rabbinical school, and someone came into, Minyan and said, like, I don't like this week's Parsha. And my teacher said, no, you can't have a favorite or not a favorite, right? It's all Torah, and we have to find the meaning in all of them. And I hear that challenge in your question, Susan, saying, like, I want to find meaning, it's harder. And just also to name something that you said, there's an extra level, because some of the image of God, right? You were talking not just on, I was talking about just like plot and reading and, right, story, but theologically, right, the God who's interested in these details of the Mishkan might not be as interesting as, right, the God who meets Moses at the burning bush. Or, right, we're headed into Leviticus, the God who's giving us all these details about sacrifices isn't as relevant to Jews today, for whom sacrifices are not part of our life. And I would say for a vast majority of the Jewish people, we don't have any desire or interest in restoring the sacrifices, right? We like our liturgy, which is a different mode of connecting with God. it makes these things a challenge. What I would say is, but I guess this hasn't answered your question more than it's validated your question. It's a great question. What I think about is where can I turn to read alongside the reading I'm doing of Parshat Shavua? What commentaries are there that are interesting? You talked about theology and images of God. I may have mentioned this at one of my times when I've been in this space with you, is I love Jack Miles wrote God, a Biography, which is meant to be a biography of the character of God in the Torah. And it on a bigger scale gives some perspective of, how God changes over time in the Bible, and zooms in at like, how can we think about God in these sections? And what I love about this book too, it's, in some ways it's a biblical studies book. What's interesting to me is that it won a Pulitzer Prize. And I love the Pulitzer Prize people because of this. It won a Pulitzer Prize not in nonfiction or in biblical studies. I don't even know that the Pulitzer gives a biblical studies, but it won the nonfiction. It won the Pulitzer Prize for biography. And I thought that said that the Pulitzer people have a good sense of humor. So I like that. Jack Miles is the name of the author. It's called God, a Biography.
Thank you.
That's one place to look. The other thing I would say is I love the JPS Torah commentary, which is a 5-volume set. They're blue, the Jewish Publication Society, and then it's not for everybody, but we're done with Shemot. I could say, I know in the beginning of Leviticus, as we enter into the section about all the sacrifices, I find both the commentaries that were brought in the Leviticus volume and some of the essays in the back try to bring some both scholarship and some theology to say how can I understand this book of Leviticus and how can I connect to it moving forward. There's a volume about Exodus too, and I found that to be a useful commentary. We're lucky in this day and age that whether you go to Google or Amazon or your independent local bookstore, there's so much out there to read. And if you have questions like Susan, what I would say is sometimes reading Torah is helpful. Torah, in the millennia that our people have been reading it, to me is not just about reading the Torah itself, but reading what others have said about it and finding the right commentaries to read alongside and help add to meaning.